Good day, and welcome to the Chesapeake Foodshed Network's Coffee Talk series, An Equal Exchange. My name is Yona Sipos, and I direct program development for the Chesapeake Foodshed Network through Local Concepts LLC, a consulting firm providing development and backbone support for the CFN. I'm joined today by Christy Gabbard, owner of Local Concepts and network coordinator of the CFN, Sonia Kiner, CFN Local Concepts Communications Director, Nancy Nunn, chair of the CFN Waste and Recovery Work Group, and also with the Harry Hughes Center for Agroecology. And in addition to all those folks and all of you, of course, I'm also joined by our resource expert, Kaylee Laliker, whom I'll introduce shortly. I'm also delighted to welcome all of you who are joining us. We had over 50 folks register from across the US and even from Canada. So it's clear that today's Coffee Talk is, and statewide and overall regional organizing is hitting a nerve of interest. Welcome, everybody. I'll also note that today's Coffee Talk webinar is hosted by the CFN Food Waste and Recovery Work Group. Before our main event, I'll provide a brief overview of the CFN and our coffee talks. The mission of the CFN is to catalyze connections and collaborations that build a sustainable, resilient, inclusive, and equitable regional food system in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, including DC, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New York. We believe that by catalyzing connections and collaborations, we are better positioned to accelerate change in and across our food system. The explicit aim of the CFN is to grow connections, get to know one another better, build trust and relationships with the thought that as we know one another better, we might over time see opportunities to align, collaborate, and contribute to collective impact. The Chesapeake Foodshed Network has been developing over the last 2.5 years among those doing the extraordinary work to advance our regional food system. If you participate in or support that extraordinary work, as well as the vision of a sustainable, resilient, inclusive, and equitable regional food system, please participate in the CFN. The Chesapeake Foodshed Network is open and free of charge to all organizations, businesses, funders, agencies, and other change agents working across the Chesapeake watershed to build a stronger and more resilient food system. Please visit chesapeakefoodshed.net to find out more. And that you can find at the bottom of your screen. And of course, I'll note that we encourage conversation and connection in various ways, including via social media. Please note the usernames and hashtags on the slide footers. Sonia will be live tweeting, and we would love to see your tweets. I think I was supposed to have put this slide up already, and this is just showing our movement from catalyzing connections, working toward alignment, and ultimately toward collaborative action. The Coffee Talks, which are funded by the Town Creek Foundation and the Prince Charitable Trusts, are a platform that the network developed to help catalyze connections around specific food system topics. We partner with resource experts who provide a quick learning opportunity through their webinar presentation for food system change agents across the Chesapeake Bay region and nation and beyond. And then during the webinar, the Q&A, and in the follow-up materials, we identify ways for people to continue to engage and dig in deeper around that particular topic. So today's Coffee Talk is an opportunity to focus on an example of statewide organizing and specifically to focus on food recovery within Maryland, highlighting the example of the statewide, first ever statewide food recovery summit within Maryland. Before introducing the speaker and passing it over, just a few housekeeping items. On your Zoom control panel, you should see a chat box, which you can open, and we will be providing prompts. I think Sonia may have already sent out a couple, welcoming everybody and directing you to please post your questions into the Q&A box, which is another icon on your Zoom webinar screen. We will be collecting your questions throughout the presentation. Please put them in at any time, and we'll moderate the Q&A with Kaylee at the end, following her presentation. Next week, the CFN will send a video recording of the presentation, follow-up resources, contacts, and a post-webinar survey, which we will also make available during the Q&A. So without further ado, I will introduce Kaylee Laliker, who will speak to you about the first ever Maryland Food Recovery Summit. Kaylee, our resource expert, is the Deputy Director of the Land Management Administration at the Maryland Department of the Environment. The Land Management Administration includes recycling, composting, solid and hazardous waste, animal feeding operations, mining, oil control, land restoration, and lead poisoning prevention programs, a lengthy list. Prior to her current position, she worked in the department's resource management program, primarily on composting and other recycling policies. So with that, as Kaylee is getting her slides up and ready to share, I will again welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. Today's Coffee Talk is organized by the Chesapeake Foodshed Network Food Waste and Recovery Work Group, and I will pass it now to Kaylee.
All right, thank you. So first, I want to just give a little bit of background about why we decided to do this Maryland Food Recovery Summit last year, and some of the things that have happened over the past few years that have led us to make food scraps a priority material. So one of the things that's happened in Maryland and nationally is that we've started to see a slowing in the growth of our recycling rate. So in 2015, we had about 43% recycling rate in Maryland, which is a pretty strong recycling rate. But when we look back to 2011, since then we've had pretty much level recycling between 43 and 45%. So there's also a quote on this slide from EPA's most recent Sustainable Materials Management Report, and it's basically describing the same trend on the national level. So there was about 15 years of pretty strong recycling growth and then a leveling off over the past 5 years. So as we've captured a lot of the easily recycled material and the waste stream has continued to change over time, it's becoming difficult to continue with the growth that we've seen over the past couple decades. So we have to look at other ways of making progress. And one of those is to focus more on source reduction and reuse, or for food scraps, food donation, and take a more holistic approach as opposed to just focusing on recycling. And then the other thing we can do is look at what materials are left still being disposed and come up with better solutions to address those. And food scraps is one of those that is still primarily being disposed in Maryland. Another thing that's happened recently is we've seen at the department a lot more emphasis and interest lately on food composting. And that actually led us to take a look at clarifying how we regulate the activity of food composting. So this is a more detailed timeline of some of the things that have happened over the past 5 years in Maryland. In 2011, there was a bill that passed requiring us to study ways to increase composting, including to review how we regulate it. So in 2012, we convened a work group to do that study. And there were 2 other important things that happened that year. First, there was a law that passed that increased the mandatory recycling rates that all of our counties have to meet to 20 or 35%, depending on their populations. And then the department also that year published a greenhouse gas reduction plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by 2020. And that was important specifically for food because in that plan, it called out waste diversion as an important climate change strategy and specifically called out food recovery. So in 2013, we had more legislation that authorized us to adopt composting regulations and clarified that materials that are being composted are not considered solid waste. And those were things that came out of that composting work group that we had. And then in 2014, we proposed composting regulations. We also that year published a document that was called Zero Waste Maryland. And that was a very aspirational document that had 60 different policy options that could be used to move forward in waste diversion. And again, food recovery was a big element of that document. In 2015, the higher mandatory recycling rates for the counties actually became effective, and we finalized the composting facility regulations. And then in 2016, we issued a general permit for composting facilities, and that is a somewhat streamlined application process. And then we also did the two things I'm going to talk a little bit more about today, which is held the Maryland Food Recovery Summit, and we did a statewide waste characterization study for Maryland as well. So in addition to all these events and developments that have happened over the past 5 years, we also have data that we look at every year that underscores why food scraps are so important as a part of our overall waste diversion efforts. So we have about 6.7 million tons of municipal solid waste that's generated annually in Maryland. And we can use EPA data on the portion of the U.S. waste stream that's made up of food to estimate that of that 6.7 million tons, about 1 million tons of Maryland's waste is food scraps. And then we get data on how much food scraps are being recycled now. So based on that, we can estimate that there's 870,000 tons of food scraps that are still being disposed in landfills and waste energy facilities every year. We also have gone out and gotten some field data to confirm the types of waste that are still being disposed. So last year, we partnered with the Northeast Maryland Waste Disposal Authority to do our first ever statewide waste characterization study. So there was a contractor that went out to various landfills throughout the state and sampled the incoming loads of waste, both residential and commercial. And they sorted it into 53 different materials and then weighed it to get the portion of the waste stream made up of each of those 53 materials. So that report's being finalized now. It's expected to be published shortly, but the data that we've seen from that so far confirms that food is very prevalent in the disposed waste stream. So of those 53 different materials that they measured, food scraps were the most prevalent one. And that was really universally true, both in residential and commercial loads, and then in all different areas of the state. And they looked at everything from rural areas in far western Maryland and the Eastern Shore to urban Baltimore City. And this is a graph that's showing the top 10 residential materials that they found in the waste sort. And you can see at the top, food scraps made up almost 18% of the incoming waste. And I think another interesting thing is that the second highest one was compostable paper, so another compostable material, which suggests that if we improve the opportunities for composting, we could really address a large portion of the waste that's currently being disposed. And this is a similar graph for commercial loads of waste, again, showing food scraps at the top at about 18% of the incoming waste. So all of this information and developments over the past few years led us to this idea of doing a Maryland Food Recovery Summit. And we'd never before done an event like this to pull together different stakeholders specifically on food recovery. So many of the stakeholders and the sectors that are involved in this, especially the food donation sector, are not ones that we often have opportunities to interact with as a regulatory agency. So this was really a chance to bring everyone into one room and start to talk about how we can work together to increase food recovery. So we invited speakers from Maryland and throughout the US, and we asked them to highlight best practices, what they're already doing, and what resources already exist on the topics of source reduction, food donation, and food recycling. And then in the afternoon, we broke into smaller groups and talked about challenges to food recovery and started to brainstorm some solutions to those challenges. So these are some of the organizations that presented at the summit. We had some organizations that have done a lot of research in this area, like the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic and Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. We also had some businesses that generate surplus food like Giant Food and Sodexo. We had institutions like St. Mary's College, food banks, representatives of composting and AD businesses. And this is a breakdown of who attended the summit. So the government sector in the darker blue was made up of all different levels of government. We had local solid waste and recycling agencies, local education agencies. At the state level, we had different areas within the Department of the Environment. We had the Maryland Department of Agriculture, Maryland Aviation Administration, Maryland Environmental Service, and the Stadium Authority. And then we were also happy to see that several other states in the region also were able to attend the summit. And at the federal level, we had EPA, both headquarters in Region 3, as well as USDA and FDA. Aside from the government sector, we had a good cross-section of nonprofit groups, solid waste and recycling companies, different food-related businesses like supermarkets and food service businesses, and then universities. So we really were able to target pretty much who we wanted to get at this summit, and it was a good variety there. I would say if there was one group that was maybe the most difficult to engage with, it was some of the larger food scrap generators, businesses that might not be based within Maryland. So it was maybe harder to attract them to a Maryland-based event. So that may be something to think about targeting in future efforts, especially if we get to do a regional event like this in the future. So there were some general themes that resonated throughout all of our presentations, and all of these themes and some of the input that we got at the summit are summarized in a document that are on our website, but I'm going to go through some of the main themes and then a selection of the specific input that we got during the discussion sessions. So the first thing we heard is that there's a lot of work and innovation that is already happening on this issue. One example is we heard a presentation from Hungry Harvest, which is a company that sells imperfect produce, and that was an example of an innovative way to rebrand and change people's perceptions about surplus food that allow it to go to its highest and best use, which is feeding people. We also had a presentation from the Means database, which is a real-time app that provides a way to connect food with someone who can use it very quickly. So these were some creative ways that people have found to overcome some of the obstacles that we've heard to food recovery. So changing people's perceptions and addressing some of the logistical issues of getting food where it needs to go quickly. And then interestingly, after the summit, ReFed has put up this website called the Food Waste Innovator Database and is starting to catalog some of these innovative efforts. A second theme is that Maryland still has a lot of work ahead of it to be able to capture more of the food that we're disposing of right now. In particular, we need to build more infrastructure for food composting. We have 5 facilities that are permitted right now to accept food scraps, and 3 of those have been constructed and are operating. So to give an idea of scale, if we were going to try to meet the EPA's 50% food waste reduction goal, we would still need to divert an additional 436,000 tons of food scraps annually. So a lot of that potentially could be done through source reduction and food donation, but it's clear that there's still a need for more food composting capacity. Third, speakers highlighted that there were a lot of resources and reports and research that's been done already. Things like the research that Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic's done. Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future has done an interactive map of Maryland's food system with different data layers on it. There have been public outreach materials put out. We heard from NRDC about their partnership with the Ad Council. So these are all things that we can take advantage of at the state and local level so that we don't have to duplicate efforts. And then also, most people, I think at this point, are familiar with the food recovery hierarchy, and there seems to be general consensus that that should guide our food recovery efforts. So we talked a lot about how businesses and institutions can use waste audits to identify different food streams that they're generating and which of those could be avoided, which could be captured for donation, and which could go for recycling. Another recurring topic was that the economic considerations are really important to address. So things like financing for constructing facilities and identifying markets for compost and other end products, and transportation costs. Those are all things that are going to need to be addressed in order for food recovery programs to be sustainable. And then lastly, a lot of the presentations highlighted different partnerships between businesses and nonprofits or between different sectors. And because this issue does cross sectors and because there are some economic and other challenges that we're facing, it's going to be very important to engage in these partnerships so that we can pool our resources and expertise. So for the breakout sessions, we split into 3 groups, and each of the groups took one of these topics, and they were asked to brainstorm what are their top challenges right now, and what are some of the potential solutions. So we had one group that looked at food recycling infrastructure, which was composting and anaerobic digestion, and we had a group that looked at source reduction and donation, and then a third group that looked at education and outreach. So in the food recycling group, a lot of the challenges that they discussed were related to siting new facilities. So this included things like counteracting potential negative public perceptions of composting, also difficulties in just finding a good location to put a facility in densely populated places with the price of property and finding one that's zoned properly are all challenges. Economic barriers, these were things like, again, obtaining financing to build new facilities. Some of the local governments mentioned lack of sufficient funding for that initial investment to take on a new facility or program. And then for businesses, there's a need to keep composting program cost competitive with disposal. For the operational difficulties, the top ones were odor control, contamination in the incoming feedstocks with non-compostable materials, lack of affordable carbon sources, and just generally the need to have more information and training out there on best practices. Market challenges included the need to educate people more on the different uses for compost. And then for gaining buy-in, there's still a lack of understanding about why composting is important and what is or is not compostable. In the reduction and donation group, we talked a lot about the need to overcome a variety of logistical issues. These were things like limited space on site for businesses to sort food for donation. There's time constraints to match food with recipients, especially when you're talking about things like prepared foods or other very perishable items. Transportation availability and costs, and just the difficulty for food banks to deal with the flow of types and quantities of food that's always changing. We also talked about some challenges related to getting buy-in on a source reduction or donation program. So within an organization, a lot of times it's a small group of people who are trying to get buy-in from the organization as a whole, and that's difficult when there's other concerns and priorities that take precedent. Training is difficult sometimes when there's constant turnover of staff. And there's also just challenges in how do you present a compelling business case for implementing these programs. For buy-in at the individual level, we talked about how consumers may have a limited understanding of how much food they're actually wasting and the economic value of that waste. And they also may have deeply ingrained habits for how they purchase and consume food. For liability and safety issues, there are liability protections out there, but we talked about how there may be some continued confusion or just still the perception that there's a risk associated with food donation. And funding, that's self-explanatory. And the last one, planning and goal setting. So this was a discussion about how we have these ambitious, sweeping food waste reduction goals, but there hasn't been as much assessment of how to get there and how much of that gap can realistically be addressed through source reduction and donation as opposed to composting. And then in the education and outreach group, we talked about consistency in messaging, how we need to have clear guidelines on what should be eaten, donated, and composted. We talked about how it's difficult sometimes to reach the relevant groups. Again, there was discussion of how employee populations are always changing, so the education needs are constant. And then for behavior and perception change, as with any form of recycling outreach, you're ultimately asking people to do something additional and different. So you need to address convenience and economic concerns that people might have. And also, again, people may not have a complete awareness of how much food that they're wasting now. And there's a perception of surplus food as having no value or being trash, and that needs to be combated with the outreach messaging. So those were the main challenges that people raised, and there were many different ideas that were brought up during these sessions. They're listed more comprehensively in that summary document on our website, but I'm going to go through just a few of them here. So one of the things that was brought up repeatedly was developing demonstration sites that can showcase different composting methods, as well as how you could use the compost and how it would benefit agriculture. We also talked about assisting businesses and institutions in performing waste audits and meeting with key groups. And some of the examples of key groups that people identified were event planners, culinary schools, and farmers. Somebody also suggested working with the school boards to incorporate food recovery better into the curriculum and identify food recovery champions within each school. Harnessing existing funding sources, things like closed loop fund and recycling partnership. We also talked about creating peer-to-peer training groups, and this was seen as sort of an inexpensive way to share knowledge and address some of the practical barriers that people are seeing with composting and food donation programs, to some of the operational issues. Plan additional events or periodic meetings for networking across public and private entities. We did a survey after the summit, and one of the main things that people mentioned as being the thing they thought was really valuable about the summit was the opportunity to network and connect with other people who are working on this issue that they may not normally interact with. And then support and get involved in efforts to address food labeling, liability, and food safety issues on a national level. So there are certain aspects of food recovery that may be better addressed comprehensively at a national level, so we can get engaged in those efforts. And then these were some of the suggestions that were specifically directed to outreach. So create model outreach materials and resources for commercial and institutional green teams, and some of the messaging that they suggested including in that would be presenting surplus food as a valuable commodity rather than a waste, emphasizing the economic benefits of waste diversion and the food recovery hierarchy, and then including simple, consistent instructions for avoiding, donating, and recycling food. We also talked about how there are existing outreach materials out there. Examples are the NRDC's Save the Food campaign and EPA's Food Too Good to Waste, and these things can be used at local levels. And then last, once the messaging is created, we talked about identifying new partners that can help in disseminating those messages. So especially groups that are really heavily involved in the community, like healthcare, faith, and education or youth sectors. So those are sampling some of the things that we talked about at the summit. As I mentioned, we did put out this summary document that has findings, and that's available on our website. We also decided to make a new separate web page for food recovery. We still have our composting web page, which has more of the regulatory information, but we created this separate website and have a lot of links to different resources. So we hope to improve that over time, and we're open to suggestions on that. Also, since the summit, this legislative session, there were 2 bills that passed that relate to organics diversion, and I just want to touch on those briefly before closing. The first one, House Bill 171, is a study bill that directs the department to study different topics related to diversion of yard waste, food residuals, and other organics. And one of the topics, it lays out about 10 different topics for us to study, but one of them I think is especially important is studying our permitting process for anaerobic digestion, and that's been something that we've wanted to look at for a couple of years. There are 22 different organizations that we're supposed to consult with in doing this study, plus a private food scrap collector. So we'll be convening that group, and we have an interim report that'll be due July 1st, 2018, and then a final report a year after that. So that will be a good next step that will allow us to look more in depth at some of the issues that were raised at the summit. The other bill that passed was House Bill 1349, and this bill relates to labeling of plastic as compostable or biodegradable. So generally, it prohibits plastic products from being labeled as biodegradable. And the thinking there is that when you make an unqualified statement that something is biodegradable, it may give people an impression that if they dispose of it in a landfill, it's going to degrade, when in reality that may not be the case. It also requires that if a product is going to be labeled as compostable, it has to actually meet a set standard to ensure that it will break down in the composting facility, and there's an ASTM standard for that, and there's also a separate standard for something to be labeled as home compostable. And then finally, assuming that something meets that standard and can be labeled as compostable, there are requirements in how it has to be labeled so that it will be apparent and can be distinguished from non-compostable products. So compostable bags and food and beverage products would need to be clearly labeled, and this is important for composting facilities so that when this material comes into the facility, they can tell immediately whether or not it is compostable. Kind of a unique thing about this bill is it provides for enforcement at the local level, so local governments would enforce this, and the requirements will start on October 1st, 2018. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Kaylee, thank you so much. That was so informative and thorough. And what we'll be doing is also sharing the link to the website that has even more detail on it. And so this was just an incredible overview of both the process that led you to the summit and also through the summit and through the processes that you used and the findings from the summit and the next steps. It was just very informative, and really appreciate the care that you took to also share the resources that you utilized and that are relevant, that have already been developed, that are relevant not just to Maryland, but across the states and probably beyond as well. We have a couple of questions. We've been collecting them, and I'll just note before we get into them, I'll encourage you to please continue to post them. Whatever questions come up right now, I'll share with Kaylee, and if we have any left over, then we'll certainly share them with her afterwards. Actually, I'll start with one that just came in on the chat panel or on the chat box, and you can either submit your questions there or into the Q&A box. Either is just fine. Here's a question, Kaylee, to start us off. Have you created the peer-to-peer learning networks? And if so, can people outside of Maryland join?
We haven't created those yet. That was an idea that just came up at the summit. So we would be open to any kind of suggestions on how to implement this. We sent out a survey, as I said, after the summit, and it did suggest that people are interested in some kind of follow-up events or regular calls or meetings or something on this, but we haven't really thought through completely how to implement that. But we can certainly at the department serve in kind of a coordinating role. We can provide space for people to meet. So those are all possibilities, and we can think about that in the future.
That's wonderful, Kaylee. And I think this next question maybe continues this theme of peer-to-peer learning and learning that crosses state boundaries. You mentioned, can you speak more about about the possibility of a regional food recovery summit? You had mentioned some limitations to getting key stakeholders to the table at a state level summit. And so what would be the potential for a larger, more regional food recovery summit?
Yeah, so that would be something we'd be interested in talking to some of our counterpoints at other states to see if they would be interested in doing something like that. And really, again, like the peer-to-peer training networks, it was an idea that we had at the summit, and we haven't fully decided how we could implement that yet. But that would be something we would maybe get assistance from some of our other equivalent departments in the other states. And I know some other groups have done it. They've done it in the Southeast, so it would be interesting to do something similar, I think, in the Mid-Atlantic area.
Excellent, thank you. Susan Wexler asked, what is the biggest challenge to creating more permitted facilities for food scrap processing?
That's an interesting question because you know, we first tried to address some of the permitting issues and get that out of the way and get our regulations completed, and we've done that, and we've now pretty much permitted all of the existing composting facilities that are out there, and that process went pretty smoothly for being a completely new regulatory program. So I don't know that it's anything related to permitting itself. I think some of the things we heard at the summit suggest that it is difficult to identify good locations in Maryland for composting facilities. We also have talked about doing maybe a focus group with some of the composters and prospective composters that we know to figure out what they view as being their top challenges. So we did kind of this broad food summit that had a lot of different stakeholders, but we also talked about doing a more narrow focus group where we could talk just to the prospective composters and see what they viewed as their biggest challenges.
Thank you. That's excellent. And I think we'll have time for one and maybe two more questions, but please continue to post them, and whatever we don't get to today, we will share with Kaylee after the presentation. And I'll also note that we'll be sending out within the week after this presentation a recording of the presentation, a PDF of the slides, any additional questions we don't get to, some follow-up resources, and also a survey, actually, that I should be posting right now to ask for your feedback already. But let me just get to this next question. What unexpected partnerships, Kaylee, may come from bringing gleaners and composters into the same room, and what does that conversation look like?
Yeah, I think that's another good point, and that gets back to kind of the overall theme of using the food recovery hierarchy to guide our programs. So, you know, you could see how gleaners could be a source of food for donation, but also there might be leftover food that would be good for composting for that. So that's exactly the kind of partnerships that we hope to foster with these kind of events where we can get everyone together in the same room.
Oh, thanks for letting me know. I was just muted, Sonia. Thank you so much for that last response, Kaylee, and thank you to everybody for joining us. Just before we move on, I'll note that I've just posted the link to the survey in the chat box, and I've also been posting, sharing some of the resources that have been coming in from our attendees. And thank you so much for that. We'd love to hear from you with additional feedback or additional ideas for further coffee talks that would address issues that Kaylee brought up, or that are more broadly within the realm of food recovery and more broadly within the realms of food systems. These are a monthly food systems opportunity to connect. Another opportunity to connect will be next week at our CFN Food Waste and Recovery Workgroup quarterly meeting. We would absolutely love to have any and all of you join us for our regular meeting that we have every 3 months. We'll also be debriefing this webinar and considering some next steps for webinars and other learning opportunities for our region interested in food waste and recovery. Everyone is welcome. The meeting is on May 18th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and more information and registration is available at the ChesapeakeFoodShed.net website. And I should just note that we invited Kaylee to participate in this webinar after several of our members, including our chair, Nancy Nunn, participated in this first ever Maryland Food Recovery Summit. And we realized from hearing from them that the outcomes and even just the process of getting everybody together and the process of getting to next steps were relevant to learn about well beyond Maryland, and especially because Maryland is the first state within the Chesapeake Bay Food Shed to hold a statewide food recovery summit. And so Kaylee, I just want to take this opportunity to thank you again for this wealth of information that you've shared in terms of both process and outputs. And thank you for all your time and sharing your expertise. I will mention just a couple of follow-up steps. Earlier, I noted that our Coffee Talk webinar series are meant not only to bring people together with the resource experts, but to provide ways for people to be connected and engaged after the webinar. And so here are just a few ways for you to dig in deeper around the webinar topic today and to learn more about the Chesapeake Food Shed Network. If you have resources or know of an event related to food recovery or related to another food systems or related to food waste and recovery, please post to our Google group, and you're welcome to sign up and you're welcome to participate as much or as little as you'd like. We will include all of these posts in the follow-up email. And like I said, and Kaylee has said, please check out the Maryland Department of the Environment's food recovery website for great resources and follow-up, as well as our Google Drive folder, the Food Waste and Recovery Workgroup Google Drive folder with data and resources as well. We'd love to hear from you about what else should be in there, and we'd love to have you join us for our regular communications from the Chesapeake Food Shed Network. You can find out more at our website. We have some great upcoming programming this summer. Everyone is welcome for all the upcoming events, and we are moving more into we're exploring some different models of engagement. We have Coffee Talk webinars coming up throughout the summer, and some of them are also followed by regional video conferences where we have opportunities to delve a little bit deeper into some of the topics. And our Food Waste and Recovery Work Group quarterly meeting is an opportunity to do that as well, to show up by video and tell us what you're working on and learn what's happening across the region and where we want to go together. Thank you so much for your time, everybody, and for your participation. Really appreciate it and look forward to seeing you at future events, and wish you all a great afternoon. Thank you so much.